Good morning, everyone. Today is April 21st, 2021, 4/21/21. That's kind of a nice, that's a nice number, isn't it? Um, and this day is what we call Moksha Day. It was the day that Swami Kriyananda passed out of his body from this world. And Master had promised him that this incarnation would end in full liberation in Moksha. So that's how we celebrate it. So I'm going to take a break from the flow of discussion we've been having and just talk about Swamiji today. So let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow at thy feet. Dearest Swamiji, help us to feel your ever-living presence within us. Let the example of your life of perfect discipleship inspire and guide us. Feel our prayers, feel our aspiration. Fill us with the power of your commitment, that we may walk in your footsteps as perfect disciples until we merge with the infinite light. Om. Peace. Amen. One of the greatest difficulties that we all face on the spiritual path is that the fundamental concepts of spiritual life are beyond the power of the ordinary rational mind to understand. That doesn't mean that there's no connecting link, because reason can be guided by intuition. Philosophy can be understood by concentration and determination. Even words on a page can carry vibrations. And something as subtle as spiritual life, we have to grasp with a different dimension of our consciousness. It's not just a matter of academic study and having enough footnotes and having enough logical ideas and then pasting together everybody's opinion and coming up with a consensus. All of that has a place in the pursuit of human knowledge, but spiritual understanding has to be a direct perception. Intellectual understanding is, as you might say, is vicarious. We put the pieces together, it makes sense, we have a thesis, we like it. Spiritual understanding is a direct revelation, and it's a direct revelation not of a theoretical idea, but of an actuality of my living experience. And over the course of many centuries, because when these great avatars come, like Yogananda or Christ, their duration of influence is almost literally without limit. Even this day in India, ancient sages are still revered, and their consciousness is still a living part of people's realities. Master said, Yogananda said, that wherever a true master has lived or been or in any way been present, especially where they have lived and walked, their vibrations exist forever. I mean, it's really something. You can just, because such masters, their consciousness transcends the limitations of time. So we would normally think, well, for example, because I've been in Israel recently, there's a place in Israel which Master himself visited and declared authentic, which was the spot where Jesus was standing when after Jesus was resurrected, he continued to appear to his disciples intermittently for 40 days. And at the end of those 40 days, he psychically, intuitively called all the disciples together to a certain place. And then he ascended, which is he abandoned the materialization of his physical body. He dissolved it. It wasn't like there was a body there again, like death, but he dissolved. He'd been holding the atoms of a physical body together by his will. This is how it's explained in Autobiography of a Yogi. And he released those atoms back into the infinite and turned himself back into light. And he ascended on that spot. And it's just this tiny little chapel. It's not owned by either by the Catholics or the Greek Orthodox, so it's very, very plain. It's just a little stone chapel. There's a little square place and there's a stone, and the stone has indentations in it, which are believed to be the imprint of the body of Christ as he was ascending. Master was there in that very little chapel. That very chapel, he said it was true. And you just go in there and you don't even know. You have two things. Swami was there. I mean, Yogananda was there. Swami Kriyananda was there also. Christ was there. It's all completely outside of time. And you can sort of reason with all of that, but it's so far beyond the course of reason. But of course, as human beings apply reason to all of this way of thinking, then gradually the revelation gets reduced to the level of reason. And this is why in the Bhagavad Gita, it explains that the avatars and their great disciples incarnate again and again and again, because what shifts it from just mere academic discussion is the living example of what it is like to be in tune with this kind of power. So, and when a master comes, he often, always, I think, brings with him his little crew, his crew of close disciples, his working team. When Ramakrishna, an avatar in the 1800s in India, in Calcutta, is where he lived, the late 1800s. The story is told that he himself told, that when he was going to take incarnation as a human being, he went into the heavenly realms, and there were 7 sages lost in the contemplation of the infinite, and the baby, which was going to be Ramakrishna, pulled those sages out of their meditation and compelled them or convinced them to come take physical birth with him, because he had a job to do. So Ramakrishna's great disciples were said to be these sages who'd taken incarnation with him. Now, Swami Kriyananda's had this very, very long-standing relationship as a disciple of Master, and in 2 other lifetimes that we know about, when Master incarnated as Ferdinand III, the King of Spain, who helped save the Spanish Peninsula for the teachings of Christ. He repelled a Moorish invasion and kept Spain as a Catholic country. And when Master incarnated as William the Conqueror in the 1100s, and then Kriyananda came in as his physical son, Henry, and when he was Ferdinand III, Kriyananda came in as his physical son, Alfonso X. And in both cases, Master himself had set the overall energy, the direction, the mission, but he had basically laid out the foundation of it, and then Swami Kriyananda, as his son, his heir, then built upon that foundation and created the detailed expression that became the enduring reality of it. If you think of the life of Christ, Christ's enduring legacy was created by those who wrote the Gospels and by Paul, who went around and converted expanded Christianity beyond the synagogues. The members of the synagogues refused to accept it, so Paul went out to what they called the Gentile world. And that's really where the power of Christianity came from. Now, of course, none of that would have been possible without the avatar planting the power of God. But the finishing, the continuation of the mission was in the hands of these great disciples. And that's a role that Swami Kriyananda has played for Master. This was the third time that we know about in this lifetime, because Master was a monk and not a king. Swami was his spiritual son rather than his physical son. But the role was exactly the same. He took what Master started and then he drew it out in a way that it was practical and visible to the world. And then Swami himself lived the life of being the offspring of the Guru. And Swami's incarnation was such an interesting one, because his entire decision was that he would be a disciple. And in the tradition of India, and even when Swami was in India, the tradition would be that the great disciple, becomes a guru in his own right. At the end of Swami's life, he accepted that. But up till the very end, he never accepted that. He only ever initiated in Master's name. And in various ways, he still affirmed that his role was essential for us. He said to me very early, Master told me that, Swami speaking of himself, that Master told Swamiji that he would not only be a teacher, but that he would bear spiritual responsibility for people. It's a very interesting thing to contemplate. And in the late 90s, Swami started asserting that for most of the people at Ananda, Swami did not replace Master, but he was an essential link to Master, which is how he put it. Now, regardless of how one draws that out in detail, which is beyond my realization to do that, he became an essential link. He is an essential link because he manifests what discipleship is in his life on earth. What we saw in Swamiji is what it means to be a disciple, which is very easy to speak about, but not so easy to do. And so powerful to have such a wealth of energy as we have from Swami. Just, hundreds and hundreds of hours of Swami's own words with his own voice and his own face, just talking to us over and over again about what Master's teachings actually mean and what they look like when they're lived. And that's a very specific example in how do you spend your time? What do you do with your creativity? How do you make decisions? How do you think about issues in life? How do you work with the words of the Master? Just how do you work with Master's words? I remember one very interesting example when we were in the early years of Ananda, and even to this day, we work very hard. Ours is not a contemplative life. Ours is a very active life. That's the example Swami set. Although Swami himself said, I believe in, going into seclusion at the end of one's life. He said, I don't want my example of working literally to the last breath to be considered what everyone has to do. Swami himself had hoped for, the opportunity to simply withdraw from the world, but it never came. It never came to him. But I remember very early on, somebody found something that Master had written. It was his own words, and it talked about the balanced life, and the balanced life was many hours of meditation every day and 5 or 6 hours of work. And that was not at all the life we were living at Ananda. And someone brought that to Swami and said, this is what Master says we're supposed to do. Swami looked at it. He said, that's for later. Later in Master's mission. He said, we've been given the assignment, as Swami often called it, to establish the beachhead. Master came to America, started this spiritual revolution. Really, Autobiography of a Yogi launched a global spiritual revolution, and it continues. It continues to be the beacon, really, of that. It's fascinating when you get into it, because people of all different paths. It's like almost everybody, and that's not an overstatement. Almost everybody who has taken what would you call it? The slightly revolutionary path, instead of just walking down the middle of what society is doing, but has tried in any field to introduce new ideas that have their origin point in the fundamental view of life of self-realization as being the goal. Even if it's not explicit, even if it's about health or food or exercise or creativity or astrology, almost anyone who is moved into what you would call the self-realization ideas of life has read Autobiography of a Yogi, and a great number of them, conceivably even a majority, will say, my personal spiritual evolution began with Autobiography of a Yogi. And then they go on to do something that may be unrelated to the specifics of Master's mission, but his presence and his book catalyzed their awakening, and they may end up being devoted disciples of another master. It's not a competition in that respect. So Swamiji, among the things that Swami was always trying to explain to us, was that we have a job to do here, and that Master gave him a job, which was, he called it a great work. And as Swami came to understand that job, it was the same job he did when he was Henry. It was the same job he did when he was Alfonso. He took the inspiration and he pulled it out in countless different directions to show how it actually expresses. So because of what Swami did with Master's work, we have this extraordinarily broad potential that we can call ourselves disciples and become musicians. We can call ourselves disciples and become dancers, or we can work in theater. We can paint. We can be an architect. We can do home building. We can be organic farmers. We can be writers. We can be teachers. We can do a whole educational system for children. And all of it is taken directly from Master's teaching. We can be business people. Think of it. Swami wrote 150 books. And there's no, it's not like it's the same book over and over again with a slight variance on it. They range from, the huge 2-volume set of yogic principles for material success, to education for life, for marriage as a path to self-realization, or as a marriage for self-expansion into realization, because it's not a separate path. I don't want to be a misnomer. Visit to saints of India, in divine friendship, letters of advice. And in all of that, what he's done for us is that each one of us we can make a life out of just one aspect. Education for life for children. We can make a life just out of that. We can make a life just out of teaching prosperity. We can make a life out of artistic self-expression. And all of it, because of the way Swami has articulated it, it all comes back to Paramhansa Yogananda, to the revolution he started. Swamiji said something very interesting on more than one occasion. The day will come, and now we're talking way into the future. Think how powerful the influence is of Jesus Christ, and 2,000 years have passed. So we're not talking about tomorrow. We're not talking about my physical lifetime, or likely any of yours either. But Swami said the day will come when the teachings that Master brought, he said, the particular, as Master called it when Swami said, is this a new religion? And Master said, no, but it's a new expression. So the new expression of ancient teachings, and new because we're moving into a higher yuga. That's the reason. Not new because the teachings have to be renewed, but because in Dwapara Yuga it can be said in a certain way. So this new expression of these ancient teachings, Swami said, the day will come when that new expression of these teachings will define all of society. He said, not Master's name, which was very interesting. He said, but the teachings that he brought, because that's what actually matters. So again, this is Swamiji. And now he didn't say that Master would be forgotten. But what he was trying to say is that it's not like Master's name and his individuality is going to be, this gigantic, overwhelming reality, although his name will live forever. Because once a Master comes, their name lives forever. And I think Swami's name will always live with him because Swamiji has exemplified it. He has exemplified what it means to be a disciple of Master. And even, quite simply, what it means to be a disciple. Swamiji was a person of enormous accomplishment. But when he was asked, what is important in your life? That I was the disciple of a great Master. That's what Swami said. I'm the disciple of a great Master. Swami wrote to a friend once just about his own view of his own life. He said, when this life is over and he stands before Master again, he said, Master will ask me one question. Have you loved me? Even just that thought is interesting. But then Swami said, and my response will be, you are all that I have ever loved. Now, I've meditated on that quite a lot. Also because you see that relationship between the guru and the disciple is, in many of the scriptures, it says, if God and all the saints are pleased and the guru is displeased, the disciple is in error. And if the guru is pleased alone, that is the only criteria that counts. Isn't that extraordinary to think about? And that at the end of Swami's life, being a disciple is all that mattered to him. I've integrated that as deeply as I can into myself. And I often try to embrace the self-definition. I am the disciple of a great Master. And what does that mean? What does that really mean? Everything that you look about in Swami's life, it was about being a disciple. And what's very interesting, which is a little bit lost in our respect and adoration for Master, was that Master himself defined himself that way also. When someone asked him about a particular thing that he was doing, why did you make this decision? Master said, it was the will of Babaji that I do so. And at the end of Master's life, there was a weaving that was a picture of Sri Yukteswar that had been gifted to Master by a disciple. And it was hanging outside his room. And Swami said, whenever Master would pass that picture, he would pranam to Sri Yukteswar. So we think of Master as, independent and the source of everything. But Master himself turned the attention toward Babaji and those who had come before him. And so Swamiji always in his life turned the credit to the source. In my own life experience, which has not been everyone's, but this has been mine, my entire understanding of Master comes from Swamiji. So I can't go around Swamiji because without him, I would know nothing. And what he has shown me is the Master behind him. But my doorway into that has always been Swami. So my gratitude has to go first to that. If I was a pianist and I'd learned to play and love Beethoven, but I'd learned to play and love Beethoven, and it's Beethoven that is the joy, but this is the teacher that taught me. How could I have one without the other? And so all of us who have had this experience, this is where Swami is talking about, quote, the essential link. All of us whose spiritual life has been defined by Ananda, it doesn't matter how you name it. The power of Babaji has flowed through Yogananda, has been given to Kriyananda, has been manifested through all of this. And in our self-honesty and our humility, we have to give gratitude all the way through that lineage. And Swamiji's involvement with us did not in any way diminish when he died. In fact, in the most remarkable way, it increased. People had asked me in the years when Swami was elderly and ailing, what would happen when he died. And what has happened is exactly what I thought would happen, which is it had become that so much of Ananda was still, even to the very end, it channeled through that physical presence of Swami. But when that little physical body, it just faded away, it's like that same energy just dispersed everywhere. It did not lose its essential vibration, which was the consciousness of Swami Kriyananda. It just became equally accessible everywhere. On the days after April 21st, 2013, when Swami passed, and I and others went to Assisi where he had died and where his body was waiting still. And I was in that temple, and Swami's body was literally laid out in front of us. I realized that the universe had no geographic center anymore. That all of my spiritual life, wherever Swami was standing, literally wherever he was on the planet, a part of me considered that to be the center of the world. And I would periodically move to where he was for a time, or by the grace of God, he would come to where I was for a time. But wherever he was standing was the center of the universe. And that was powerfully expansive. But when I was there and he was gone, and his body was still there, but he wasn't in it anymore, I realized that creation had no center now, no geographic center. And even though it was the end of a golden age, and I was naturally sorry to see it pass, it was also wildly expansive and completely transformative, because now every atom of creation, every place on planet Earth was the same. It just, now everything was the same. And Swami's presence was equally everywhere, which in theory had always been true and in experience had been true. But this tremendous expansion took place. And that expansion continues. And insofar as we are interested, the way Swami talked about his leadership when he was still in his body was that he would project thoughts and ideas to people he thought might be receptive. And if they were interested, and if his inspirations resonated, they would receive them, take them into themselves, and act upon it. And I personally lived that reality for decades, and even more powerfully, live it still. This is a potential that's in front of us, which is to become ever deeper in our discipleship to this line of gurus through the messenger that Master has sent to many of us, to help us understand how to be the only reality that really matters, which is disciples of a great master. As I often write to my friends, what very, very, very good karma we have. What a blessed life we've been called to. And what a joy to live for God. God bless you, my friends.